Welcome back to Research Unpacked from the Informed Performance Podcast. My name is Dylan Carmody, and I'm a physical therapist and strength and conditioning coach from the U.S. On today's show, we have Danny Lum, and we'll be discussing his research on isometric exercise, more specifically, his recent paper comparing the acute effects of session of isometric strength training with heavy resistance training on neuromuscular function.
This episode has been sponsored by Vol Performance, makers of ForceDecks, the world's fastest, easiest, and most powerful dual force plate system. ForceDecks can help you to analyze neuromuscular strength, performance, and imbalances in your athletes. With an incredibly simple setup and intuitive software, ForceDecks automatically detects over 15 common force plate tests and analyzes them with a single click, helping you to collect quick and accurate insights on your athletes. To learn more, head over to our sponsor, volperformance.com. Informed Performance is a proud partner of HUMAC Norm by CSMI. By using the HUMAC Norm isokinetic system, you can see what you are treating. An isokinetic test measures maximum muscle capacity through range of motion. So when you're comparing an athlete's involved side's results to their uninvolved, this system makes it easy but objective to see where strength deficits exist to help you design a very efficient path to function. Then follow-up testing on the machine will confirm if your athlete or athletes are on the right path or if changes still need to be made. To learn more about the new HUMAC Norm and their refurbished machines, visit humacnorm.com.
Danny, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for inviting me over.
Of course, man. We are very excited to dive into all things isometrics with you, and I think today's going to be a super fun conversation for not just us, but hopefully the listeners as well. So for anyone who may not be familiar with who you are just yet or haven't read any of your research, would you mind just sharing your current roles and responsibilities and maybe a little bit of the path that you took to get there as well?
Okay. So my name's Danny Lum. I'm the head of strength conditioning at Singapore Sport Institute. So I started my PhD studies in 2018, and my topic of research was on isometric strength training. So since then, I've done quite a number of isometric training studies, and the thing that started me on isometric training was back in 2015. I was training our judo team, and with grappling sports, you have a lot of periods of isometric contraction during the fights. So I started including isometric work with my athletes, and it went well with them. And especially with one of the athletes who was he was huge. He was like 150 over to 200 kilogram, and it was really hard for him to do a lot of exercises because he was just new to resistance training. So isometric worked well for him, and they did well in the 2015 Southeast Asian Games. Usually the athletes are always complaining about them not being strong, not able to match the other competitors from other countries in terms of strength wise. So it went well that year. They got strong enough, and I thought, well, it worked well for the judo athletes. Let's try it out with other athletes as well. So I did some isometric training with our swimmers. Again, most of them who actually did the isometric training managed to achieve good results during the competition, the subsequent competitions. And and after that, I did a lot more literature review, and I realized that there wasn't much research on isometric training for athlete performance. So, and that was how I started my PhD study.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's really cool to hear too that they're a little bit different athletic populations too, right? I feel like a lot of times we hear about isometric training or, isometric resistance from a perspective of either rehab or performance training in, athletes like basketball players, volleyball players, soccer, things like that, football for those also listening. But it's interesting to hear about more of these kind of tactical or combat-based athletes or grappling athletes. And I know you've done some work with, like paddling athletes like kayakers and swimmers and things like that as well. And so it's just really cool to see the carryover that a style of training has to a bunch of different areas. But without getting too off track and not talking about the thing before defining it, let's just go into some ideas behind, the definition of isometrics and how we can kind of differentiate isometrics versus just more traditional resistance training or something like isotonics.
All right. So isometric muscle action involves generating of force without any external movement. So in the literature, you can identify two types of isometric: the hold and the push isometric. So the push isometric involves pushing against something that you can't move, exerting force against something you can't move. For example, pushing the wall, or you load up the barbell and you try to do a deadlift, but it's too heavy for you to lift it. While the hold involve resisting a given amount of force and not having any movement. So examples like wall sit, prone planks, side planks, these are whole isometric muscle action. And the difference between isometric and traditional resistance training is basically isometric training. You have no movement, right? You're still producing force, exerting high amount of force, but there's simply no movement. And advantage of isometric because there's no movement involved, so the risk of injury is much lower. And with traditional resistance training, we tend to have the eccentric phase, which we know that eccentric phase usually, if you are doing very heavy eccentric, you get DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness. With isometric, you have less. It's less likely for you to get DOMS. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, I love that. And also some of the more recent literature on isometrics is that like you can even have like a protective effect from getting DOMS before, like if you're performing some type of isometric exercise before a eccentric or before isotonic exercise. Is that am I getting that right?
Yeah. There were some studies on it. I think a couple of years back. I think that the most recent thing about isometric training is its effect on blood pressure. So that was in the British journal. I can't remember the sorry, just slipped my mind what the journal is. Yeah, there was a meta-analysis on it, and they found that compared to other modes of exercise, including aerobic, isometric training seems to have the greatest beneficial effect on lowering blood pressure.
Yeah, so many interesting like rabbit holes that you can go down with that. I feel like especially, previously when people think about isometric exercise, they think about like this highly strained activity where you would assume just due to, maybe blood shunting activities or things like that from the tension inside a muscle like that, the blood pressure itself would increase rather than, maybe from a longevity perspective, the actual blood pressure as a whole at a resting intensity, I guess, would be decreased over time. But that's very interesting. Going in a little bit more in terms of the paper that you have just recently published, can you just give us a little background in terms of what the reason was for the paper and just kind of what your overall, I guess, kind of research question was and why you really wanted to ask that question in the first place?
Okay. So there were a number of. I was just trying to compare the fatiguing effect of traditional heavy resistance training and isometric training. There were studies in the past to compare the different types of muscle contraction, so eccentric, isometric, but they did not use exercises that were commonly used during a strength conditioning training. So things like squats, lunges, RDLs. So I decided to have a look at it. And so in that paper, the traditional strength training, basically we use squat, RDL, and split squat. And with the traditional strength training, I actually use the velocity-based training method to prescribe the number of repetitions per set. So we use a 20% threshold, 20% velocity threshold to stop that particular set. Right. So meaning those who are not familiar with it, I got the participants to lift the weights, and I have a linear transducer to measure the velocity of the lift. And once the lift, whichever repetition it is, that showed that the mean velocity had dropped by 20% from the highest velocity of that set, participant will stop lifting for that particular set. So with that, because some research have shown that 20% seems to be better at improving both strength and rate of force development, that's why we use 20%. And with isometric training, we standardize it to each set having 5 repetition and 3 seconds contraction. That's because one of my earlier research showed that this seems to be effective at improving both strength and rate of force development as well. So we were not able to equalize in terms of intensity and volume because they're basically very different type of contraction. But what we did was to use what seems like one of the optimum method for improving strength and rate of force development as shown in the literature. So comparing these two modes of training that way. And what we found was that acutely, so 5 minutes after both condition, the drop in performance were quite similar. But 24 hours later, participants seems to be able to recover better after isometric training as compared to heavy resistance training. So one of the reason is probably due to the eccentric contraction involved during the heavy resistance training, and that induce more soreness and more performance drop as compared to isometric training. So based on that result, we suggested that in times where athletes are fatigued, in times where athletes are closer to competition, then maybe coaches can substitute some heavy resistance training with isometric training, so as to reduce the amount of fatigue induced on the athletes. And also, as you are closer to competition, and I mentioned earlier that isometric training, since there's no movement involved, the risk of injury is lower. So it seems like it is a viable option for coaches to use. But one thing to note is this study wasn't meant to compare which one is better at improving strength and speed and so on. So I don't want people to get misled into thinking that, isometric training is the best and so on. Because I've always advocated that you need to mix the training around so that you can take advantage of every mode of every mode of training to enhance the athlete performance and to let the athlete get the optimum adaptation. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that was perfect. Danny, thank you for just giving a very nice summary and understanding of, what your paper said. And also you're stealing some of my questions. I dig it. I always love asking, what does your paper say? And then what did your paper not say? Just because it's common for people to take things and run with it. But I appreciate what you had added there. Just because I think it's important to understand, like, all right, this is what we meant to do with the paper, and this is what the paper showed. We're not going to make any other extra claims of saying that then it's going to, add 100% to your next back squat session or something ridiculous. It's like it just is helpful from a neuromuscular readiness perspective, maybe. I'm curious about the actual interventions themselves from the velocity-based training as well as from the isometric training. So both of those, you did a great job of like quantifying what they were doing, right? You're quantifying velocity and also quantifying both force and impulse and all those sorts of things. When you were doing that with the participants, was that like a feedback based, where like from the velocity based thing, like did the participants receive feedback based on how fast they were moving, or did the exercise stop once the threshold was not met without their knowledge of meeting it or not?
They did not get the feedback immediately. That means during the set when they're executing the exercise, they did not get the feedback. But when they were resting, they were showed what happened during that set.
Okay, gotcha. And then from the isometric training perspective, obviously they were around the 3-second hold, if I'm correct in there. But was there a similar format in terms of feedback in between the actual sets as well?
Yeah. So we actually showed them what the laptop, the screen on the laptop, how the force was like and things like this right after the set. Yeah. So every set they get the feedback right after they're done with it.
That's great. That's super helpful too, just to kind of it's nice to see, especially within while they're still working, but not maybe influencing the set itself as a whole, which I think is probably a pretty smart way to go about it. Before we dive into a little bit more on the isometric side of things, I'm just curious for the listeners who maybe haven't read the paper, things like that. Do you want to dive into some of the tests that you were using to assess for neuromuscular readiness, and then maybe some of the findings that you saw with those specific tests?
Okay. So we used counter movement jump, sprints, isometric mid-thigh pull. A little boring because it's the common test used to measure athletic performance, but it's simple and reliable, so we went ahead with it. So what we found was that with both conditions, we actually saw decrease in performance for all three tests acutely. So 5 minutes after that, we could see that there were drop in counter movement jump, sprints, and strength performance. But 24 hours later, all three tests performance drop was still not recovered. They did not get back to baseline in the heavy resistance training condition, while in the isometric condition, they all went back to baseline. And we could see some participants, there was actually delayed potentiation effect. So there was a small improvement in the performance of for some participants. And one might think maybe they did not exert maximum force, but based on what we saw from the graph, because they perform all exercises on the force plate, so we could actually tell that they are actually whether they are actually exerting maximum force or not. So we controlled that, and so based on that, we found that isometric training seems people who perform the participants, when they perform isometric training, they seem to be able to recover quite quickly within 24 hours. And it's quite consistent with literature in regard to heavy resistance training. So most other studies that looked at the fatiguing effect of heavy resistance training have shown that it takes 48 to 72 hours to recover back to baseline if people are actually doing intensive heavy resistance training. And with resistance training, dynamic resistance training, again, because we used the 20% velocity threshold, our participants did not get to failure every set. None of the set, actually. So even then, it requires more than 24 hours. So there are athletes or people who likes to get to failure every set, or at least one set per session. With that, they probably need even more time to recover.
Yeah, that's definitely a talking point that I feel like I've brought up with athletes before in the past. Is like this idea of, like if all days are high, then no days are actually high, in terms of intensity. Like if you're going to failure on every single, like time you're walking into the gym on a certain exercise, well, your actual neuromuscular readiness or your ability to perform that exercise is already inhibited on day 2 or day 3 of attempting that exercise than it would be. So already you're not going in with a full tank of gas. And so making sure that there's either sufficient exercise programming that allows for either active recovery or some type of other methods in terms of making sure somebody who may, for whatever sport demands, needs to have a higher volume of training, that people can actually still work around that. However, making sure that we're not still just, beating a dead horse, so to speak, there. But one thing that I found pretty interesting within the paper was the key performance indicators that you used for the counter movement jump in terms of, using mean propulsion force, time to take off, propulsion phase time, all those sorts of variables. I think a lot of times when there are people who are kind of appraising research and playing the armchair quarterback kind of position, so to speak, people can poke at things and say, well, they just took a lot of different variables that mean the same thing, or that are trying to represent the same idea, just so that they could try and find some significance. But actually in the paper, you guys had a really cool point in terms of the interaction of some of these variables that may have led to the outcome that you were observing. Yeah. I'm trying not to steal your thunder, but can you just maybe speak on that a little bit within the isometric group?
Okay, so first I want to give credit to a group of scientists. The lead author was David Bishop. So I think a couple of years back they wrote a paper, and it was published in a strength conditioning journal about measuring the matrix of jumps. And so with that, my decision to use those matrix was influenced by that paper. And so a lot of time when you see research, they measure counter movement jump. It's just jump height. But with jump height, we don't know what actually influence the change in jump height. So like right now, if I get you to do vertical jump, 3 repetition of it, your jump height can change by quite a fair bit, with you just performing the jump differently. So if I didn't actually measure things like counter movement depth, contraction time, and so on, I wouldn't know what actually changed the jump height. Yeah. So and that was why we added it in to provide readers with more information on why there was change in jump height. Was there a change in jump strategy and so on? So we could see that there wasn't much change in contraction time for the isometric training group. there wasn't much change in jump height as well, meaning that they did not change the jump strategy even after they were fatigued. All right. And it was the same for the heavy resistance group as well. They did not change the strategy because the counter movement depth wasn't changed that much. But you could see that even though the counter movement depth was similar, but the contraction time was longer. All right. Meaning that they weren't able to exert force as quickly as they were before the resistance training. Yeah. So we know then what is the cause for the change in jump height, right? So if I see a change in jump height and then I see that contraction time did not change, but there was a change in counter movement depth, then I know what is the cause of that change in jump height. All right. So this is why we wanted to include all these variables, and this allows readers to have better idea behind on the mechanisms behind all these changes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in total, it's the understanding. Like these are the determinants of the jump height itself, and being able to understand that. There may not be one specific, like this changes and this changes and this changes, but because there are so many different variables that are influencing, or there are so many different determinants of this jump height, it is important to make sure that we can track, as many of them as possible so that we can understand what's influencing what based on the interventions that you guys gave, as well as the, subsequent adaptations or responses that were occurring to those sorts of interventions. I am going to pivot a little bit here and go a little bit more into the idea of implementing isometrics and things like that, and talk a little bit more about that. Before, we had talked about this idea, whether they're called overcoming or yielding or pushing and holding, hima, pima. There's a bunch of different words that all mean essentially the same thing with these different types of isometrics. Can you tell me about the specific type of isometric that you guys used in the paper, and then why you ended up using that type of isometric?
Okay, so we use the push isometric, which is exerting force against something you can't move. And the reason why we do that is because with push isometric contraction, you can actually exert maximal voluntary force, voluntary contraction, and exert max amount of force within each position. With whole isometric, we will have to use a submax load. Both in the literature, you can see that both isometric action has quite distinct differences. You can see that push with the whole isometric, people tend to fatigue earlier at the same given intensity. For the lower, for the extremities, but for the trunk muscle, the muscles can exert a force longer with whole isometric as compared to push. This is probably because the difference in daily usage of the muscle. Our trunk muscles are meant to hold the position of our posture, and that's why it's adapted to the whole isometric action, while the extremity tends to be pushing things around. So it's more suitable for the push isometric action. Yeah. So yeah, the main reason is also because most of my research I've used the push isometric, and I'm basically more familiar with that. Less is studied, even in the current literature, less is studied for the whole isometric, how it affects athlete performance and so on. Yeah, and the prescription method and everything is not standardized as well. It's not as standardized as the push isometric. So at the moment, that's why I have used the push isometric instead. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, and that's super understandable and helpful. It's a little bit easier as well to kind of constrain the movement as well, just to make sure that you're getting what you really want to get out of it. With that, obviously, so part of the interventions was that you had multiple joint angles for a lot of these isometric positions. And one of them was a hinge type position, right? However, also one of the tests or the KPIs that you were using as well was this isometric mid-thigh pull. Given some of the similarities between that kind of like overcoming hinge base position as well as an isometric mid-thigh pull, did you feel, or do you feel like there could have been some type of like learning effect that could have happened between those when you go from pre to post, or do you think that would kind of came out in the wash?
It wouldn't. It's okay. The muscle action would have been different. Because with mid-thigh pull, it's actually a more upward vertical push, while the hinge, you're trying to basically get your hips coming forward. So the muscle action, well, at least the intended muscle action would have been very different. Yeah. And muscle utilization is quite different as well. With the RDL hinge, we're looking more at activating the glutes and the hamstring. With the isometric mid-thigh pull, it's a lot more quad dominant. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And also I think it's important to note that this was a crossover trial as well. So it wasn't just that, there was one group that then was able to get some better effect, or they were better able to be anchored to a heavy stimulus, and then the other group wasn't. Both groups were getting the same thing essentially.
Yeah.
But
so that's why I would use the word both condition instead of both groups, because they were the same group of people. Yeah.
Super fair. When it comes to some of these kinds of implementations, or the programming behind these types of like overcoming isometrics, commonly there's this concept of the repetition duration reserve. Can you maybe go into what this concept is, and maybe what your thought process was in terms of programming these types of isometrics, in terms of like the timing of each repetition?
Okay. Honestly, unfortunately, I have not studied too much into it. When we did the study, what I've noticed is that the force, so from rep 1 to the rep 5, and even from the very first set to the final repetition of the third set or fourth set, the peak force did not actually drop more than 15% for all participants. So if I go as compared to the velocity, if I compare it to the velocity threshold heavy resistance, it's quite similar. Like we didn't want them to go below 20%. So our unintentionally, the training was it actually kept participants at the end of the training session, they were sort of still within the 80% of their max capacity. Yeah. So I have not really looked at what is the optimum in terms of how much force should we retain after each session for isometric training. So like for velocity training, for example, again, you have seen in research that they try to make sure that they keep within the 20% velocity threshold or within the 10% velocity threshold. But with isometric training, we have not come up with a guide to say, every training you should make sure that participants should not drop to what percentage of peak force. Yeah, so with that, we have not looked at it yet, but so far, based on what I have always been using, 3 times 5 times 3 seconds or less, it seems to be quite effective to enhance athlete performance. Yeah. But if we look at the post-activation performance enhancement effect, we would, during each set of isometric contraction, we should keep it within 5 seconds. Yeah. So based on what I have seen in literature, anything above 5 seconds probably cause too much fatigue. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And that's my understanding too, especially when you look at some of the other work from like, what Alex Natera puts out and some other isometrics based researchers, the idea, I guess, from the repetition duration reserve was just, if you're going all out at theoretically giving 100%, most people can probably hold on to that for about 10 seconds, and so if you're cueing somebody to say you're going to go as hard and as fast as you can, generally trying to keep to like that 20 to 30% kind of range is helpful, just so that, like we've been saying, we don't want that fatigue to drop, or that peak force to drop because of fatigue or things like that. But yeah, it's just a super interesting concept and area to explore even further. But understanding that, isometrics are commonly described as these sort of position-specific exercises. Can you unpack maybe just like what we mean by saying position-specific, and how we may be able to kind of improve not only our force production, but maybe like the technique or technical force transfer aspects of exercise?
Okay. So how should I put it? All right. So people have the perception that if you do isometric training at 120-degree knee angle, you will only be strong at 120-degree knee angle. Yes, you will gain most amount of strength at 120-degree knee angle, but you will still gain strength through a certain range of movement. So how much range, it's dependent on, again, the angle that you train at. So if you want to have a greater increase through, you want to have increase through a greater range of movement, then you should train at the angle where muscle length is longer. So I take quads, for example. So let's say this is my quads, and if I get my knee to bend to 90-degree angle as compared to 120-degree knee angle, my quads will be stretched to a longer length at 90-degree. So if I train at 90-degree as compared to 120, my strength will increase to a greater range, say 30-40-degree. But with 120-degree, maybe the strength will only increase through a range of 15 to 20-degree. So that is an example of how we can increase our strength if we use isometric training through a greater range of movement. Yeah. But if we look at trying to increase hypertrophy, then working at a longer muscle length would be more favorable. So it's pretty similar to dynamic training. If you want to have more hypertrophy, go through the greater range of movement.
Yeah, no, I love that. And it's super interesting just to understand that idea of, especially, maybe the exact mechanisms haven't been unpacked there, but I do think, kind of like what you've been saying, there's definitely some relationships there in terms of, the greater muscle length as well as the greater range of motion from a hypertrophy-based training perspective. So in terms of this kind of implementation of these sorts of ideas, especially when you're talking about a push versus a hold for different aspects of training, would there be times, understanding more that like this kind of hold isometric would almost induce more of this quasi-eccentric type quality. Are there certain times in which you would want to implement something like that over a push isometric?
Okay, so we did a preliminary study comparing push and whole iso. What we found was that the whole iso seems to be more effective in inducing hypertrophy, while the push seems to be better at increasing the maximal strength. So say at this phase, training phase, my emphasis is more on hypertrophy, and then I want to include some isometric training as well. So then I'll use the whole isometric method, right? But when it comes to improving rate of force development and maximal strength, then I would prefer to use the push isometric training method. Yeah. In terms of whether it helps more with concentric and eccentric, we have not really looked into it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Yeah. I mean, all of those different implementation styles and mechanisms behind it is always just interesting for me to kind of soak up. So I appreciate that a lot. Trying to, be conscious of your time here, and we'll probably be wrapping up shortly, but you guys mentioned that there was a greater impulse that was incurred within the isometric group versus the heavy resistance training. However, there was essentially equal rating of perceived exertion, actually improved perceived recovery status within the isometric training group, as well as improved, actual recovery of some of that neuromuscular qualities that you were accessing. Can you maybe walk us through just some of the mechanisms that we may be able to use to describe the phenomena that we're seeing, where it's like, well, if someone's experiencing more impulse, but they're actually better recovered, can we just unpack some of that?
Okay. So impulse, we know, is force multiplied by the time. So the amount of force you produce at a certain time. With isometric muscle action, you can actually sustain a given force longer as compared to concentric and eccentric action. So because each repetition for the iso condition was actually maximal effort. So and 3 seconds, holding for 3 seconds. So participants basically attempted to produce maximal force for a duration of 15 seconds for that for each set, right? But with the heavy resistance training, it's not possible for me to get participants to do repetitions of 1 RM, right? Yeah, so the load was, each repetition was at submaximal, 80, more than 80% for the squat, and close to 80% for, it was, so for RDL, it was at 90% of the 1 RM squat. So in terms of relative intensity for RDL, is also close to 80% of the maximum intensity. And then for the split squat, we did 35% of 1 RM squat. So that gave us a range of around 5 to 7 repetition before they get to 20% loss, threshold loss. So you can see that each repetition for heavy resistance training was at sub-maximal load. So and that is why, if you look at the total impulse, it wasn't possible for heavy resistance condition to have as high of a total impulse as compared to isometric, and that explains the lower total impulse. And why the fatigue? Why is there faster recovery for iso? As I mentioned earlier, isometric compared to eccentric. Eccentric would cause more muscle damage, more muscle soreness, and that is probably one of the reasons why we can see a faster recovery for isometric as compared to heavy resistance training. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. And it's just a really interesting way in terms of we can kind of still allocate high and heavy loads, to a system. The idea of like the classic like general adaptation syndrome from Hans Selye, years ago kind of rings a bell in my head of like, we almost want, like, by implementing some level of isometric training, we're trying to mitigate some of that kind of alarm phase or that dip in the graph that people may be imagining, as much as possible, while still trying to amplify the resistance or like the potentiation or however else you'd like to describe that effect or the improvement. So we're essentially just trying to get as much bang for buck as we can within a certain type of exercise, and it's, I always just find that, especially when you equate things to impulse, which I always enjoy doing, it's just very interesting to me. But Danny, thank you so much for just being on the podcast, sharing all the insights that you have and the information. Is there anything else that we haven't talked about the paper or about your work that you would like to just touch on before we close things up?
Okay. So I mentioned earlier that I think this is very important to avoid coming to conclusion that which training method is better than the other. As I mentioned, we should never do that, because that is just basically shortchanging our athletes. So what we need to do is to better study each training method, understand what are the advantages and disadvantages, and then plan the training accordingly, using different method at different time point to help our athletes enhance their performance. Yeah, so I think that is probably the most important thing we coaches have to do. Yeah,
totally. Yeah, you're studying the thing for what it is, not necessarily comparing it to something else, but just saying, hey, this is isometric training, or this is eccentric training, or this is sprint training or something. This is what it is. This is what it does. And these are the things that we can hang our hat on in terms of like what it is and what it does, rather than saying it is better than an eccentric or it is better than an isometric or whatever it is. We're at some point, depending on how you're categorizing exercises, we're comparing apples to oranges to begin with. And so saying that you like oranges, I'll just say, okay, cool, I'm an apples guy, So Danny, knowing that we have a similar audience in terms of, whether they be researchers, rehab professionals, strength and conditioning coaches, sports scientists, all this kind of realm of human performance, based on like understanding who our audience is and these interests, who do you think that we should have on next on the podcast?
Right. So one of the person I like to follow is Gareth Sanford. Yeah. So Gareth does a lot on work a lot on endurance training. He looks at VO2 max, maximal sprint speed reserve, and things like that. Yep. So it would be interesting to talk to him.
Yep. Okay, I love it. We'll be sure to reach out to him and try and get him on the podcast. And then final question, how can others, find you if they want to connect with you or just learn more about the research that you're doing? If you want to talk about any of the other ventures that you're doing as well, feel free to share it with the audience.
Yep. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Instagram. So people can look for me, Danny Lum. Yeah.
Awesome. Right on, Danny. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. Your insights are greatly appreciated, and I hope that we connect soon.
All right. Thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation.